Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. A very special warm welcome to our Tree Council supporters and our volunteer tree wardens as well. My name is Sarah Lom, and I'm CEO of the Tree Council, which is the charity that brings everyone together for the love of trees. This week, we're delighted to be celebrating the first ever National Hedgerow Week, which is brought to you in partnership with our good friends at People's Trust for Endangered Species, Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, More Trees, which is a small community nursery down in Devon, HedgeLink, the Royal Parks Guild, and the University of Reading. This fantastic new initiative began on a cold winter's morning last December when we'd heard about the government's Green Recovery Challenge Fund, and we decided it was a great opportunity to raise awareness of all the amazing things that hedges do for us, not only in the countryside, but also in our cities. We wanted people to notice their hedges. We wanted to encourage bigger, healthier, better connected hedgerows and to provide information on how to care for them and the wildlife that they support. So thanks to a successful bid to DEFRA and a National Lottery Heritage Fund, we not only have National Hedgerow Week, we're also going to plant 53 kilometres of hedgerow, 2,650 hedgerow trees, train 10 new apprentices, and create a brilliant new knowledge hub with lots of guidance on hedgerow management for farmers, local authorities, and homeowners. So tonight is the first in our Hedge Talk webinar series, and we're delighted, especially delighted, to be joined by our hedgerow hero, Megan Gimber, who's going to explore the history of hedgerows and their importance for the environment, for wildlife, and our well-being. One brief item of housekeeping: if you have questions as Megan goes along, do pop them in the Q&A and we'll have time to answer some of them at the finish. And now it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Megan Gimber, hedgerow and habitat expert at the People's Trust for Endangered Species. Megan is one of the nation's greatest hedgerow heroes. She's been campaigning for many years for better data on hedgerows, more connectivity across the countryside, and improved management of the beautiful hedgerows that we already have. Megan's joining us this evening from her narrow boat. She's floating amongst the waterside hawthorn hedgerows, and she told us earlier that she's actually also surrounded by cuckoos. So over to you, Megan.
Hello all, bear with me while I get my slides presented. Sarah, can you see my slides? Are they there? Fabulous. Okay, so thank you for that. I am Megan Gimber and I work for a charity called People's Trust for Endangered Species, where I'm the key habitats officer. My main focus is hedgerows, and it's fair to say that I am a bit hedge obsessed. While I'm aware that hedgerows themselves are not in fact an endangered species, it is a habitat that fits really well with the work that we do as a charity, as we focus on a number of species such as dormice and hedgehogs that depend on hedgerows. So this talk will be a whistle-stop tour of hedges because there's only so much you can fit into an hour. I'll talk about the wildlife, the value to landowners, the history, and a bit about their management. But first, some context. Sadly, we are facing the double threat of a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that hedgerows are going to solve either of these, sorry, but I may be able to convince you that they're a really good place to start and should certainly be considered as part of our larger arsenal. 70% of the UK is agricultural land, a further 12% is urban. So what we do within this is hugely important for all of our native wildlife. So in conservation, there are two very different strategies for protecting wildlife. There's land sparing and there's land sharing. Land sparing is the idea that we set aside land just for wildlife, where it can thrive and get on with things separated from the actions of us. Land sharing, on the other hand, is the idea that we can manage land in a way that benefits us, like farming, producing food, whilst also supporting wildlife. So increasingly, this is the basis of some really fierce debate between those that favour rewilding and those that favour regenerative agriculture. So do we go for separation or do we go for integration? It is a huge debate, and to be perfectly honest, I think the situation that we're in necessitates a bit of both. And luckily, when it comes to land sharing, hedgerows have the potential to provide us with some easy wins. So as a conservation charity, we're primarily interested in hedges for their value to wildlife, and this value is incredible. A great example I like to use is how vital they are to dormice, partly because they are hugely charismatic little guys, but also because they were one of the initial drivers for our hedgerow work. It's estimated we've lost about 51% of our dormice population since the millennium, and we know they've gone extinct from about 17 counties in the last 100 years. So it's fair to say that they are in a bit of trouble. Now, as part of our dormouse conservation work, we reintroduce dormice to areas of the country where they've previously been lost. And before we do this, we need to make sure that these new populations are not isolated and that they have good connectivity to other dormice populations. So this is really important for dormice because this connectivity may allow them to inhabit fragments of woodland that may otherwise be too small to support a population. It can help gene flow between dormice in different woodlands. It can allow movement that can recover declining populations. And crucially, it can allow dormice to migrate to suitable new habitat as and where it becomes available. Sadly, the effect of climate change may make this ability to relocate increasingly important for dormice. Being arboreal creatures, meaning they don't really like scampering across the floor, but they prefer travelling through branches, it's hedgerows that provide the safest way for dormice to cross our countryside. And incidentally, although it's not their primary habitat, hedgerows can also be capable of sustaining breeding populations of dormice. But to do this, they need to be healthy. They need to be large and they need to be species rich. Dormice eat a variety of foods, which changes throughout the year. And this means they need a hedge with a variety of species growing in it to fully support them. And what's great about using dormice is that if we get hedges right for them, and they are fussy little things, we have created a habitat that's capable of supporting a broad range of other species as well. So that's where we started, but it's fair to say that our commitment to hedges extends far beyond any individual species now. So why are hedgerows so great for wildlife? Well, as far as I see it, they provide three large roles. Firstly, a physical home. So from nesting birds, hibernating hedgehogs, dormice, small mammals, insects, beetles, butterflies. One study counted 2,070 species in just 85-metre stretch of hedgerow in Devon. 2,070. If you were to do a hedge species every day, it would take you over 5.5 years, which is pretty amazing. And the author of this study, Robert Walton, says that even this is an underestimate of the true number, as he was only counting species that you could see with the naked eye. And just remember, this was in just 85-metre stretch of hedge in Devon. So imagine what they can hold nationwide. Secondly, they are an excellent complementary habitat. So this is one that isn't necessarily home, but plays an important role in life. So this can be food, such as leaves, flowers, berries, insects, or things that might be hunting charismatic little mammals. Or it could be things like shelter from predators or shelter from the elements whilst out foraging. A massive 84% of our farmland indicator bird species make use of hedgerows, where only 52% is their actual physical home. And thirdly, and importantly, they are used as wildlife corridors. So this is connecting populations that would otherwise be isolated and vulnerable, like I described for the dormice. But this is equally important for bats, for flying insects like butterflies and moths, many of which use the warmth and the shelter created by a hedge to allow them to fly. Bats actually are another really good example about hedgerow value. I was once told that bats need 3 things to thrive in a habitat. They need a roosting site, they need a safe commute, and they need insects to feed on. Hedgerows and hedgerow trees can provide all 3. And again, that reflects their use as a home, a food source, and for connectivity. So all of our native bat species are nocturnal. They all echolocate, and all of them are insectivorous. And 14 out of 18 of our native bat species will roost in trees. So hedgerow trees are particularly important. So bats use hedges to travel between roost sites and feeding sites, but they also exploit the insect populations that a hedge can produce. So when hedges are removed or hedgerow trees are removed, as well as fragmenting that connectivity, reducing the amount of food that's produced, it also increases local wind speeds. And this can make it more difficult for insects to fly on windy nights, which means on windy nights, bats don't have as much food available to them either. Even bats that don't live in trees actually do also depend on hedges. So hedges and tree lines form part of the main foraging habitat of the greater horseshoe bat, which again, sadly, has suffered huge declines in recent years. So hedges are a man-made and man-managed habitat. So it may seem odd that they are so rich in wildlife. But while they aren't a natural habitat, actually in structure, they're what we call an ecotone. And this is where two or more habitats overlap and cross over. And in this case, their structure mimics the rich habitat seen at a woodland edge. So this photo is quite interesting. One side is a hedgerow and the other side is the edge of a woodland. But can you tell which side is which? I took this photo and I couldn't hand on heart say I know which side's which anymore. So for hedgerows, we've got overlapping elements of woodland with open grown trees, which is in my view even better. We've got scrub and we've got grassland or pastureland. And while it certainly doesn't replicate any of these habitats fully, it does mean a hedge is capable of supporting many species from each of them. A good example is 80% of what we would normally call woodland bird species can also live in hedgerows. And for some species, a hedge is even greater than the sum of its parts. Some are dependent on more than one or even all of these elements to survive. A really good example, I think, is a song thrush. So a song thrush will sing from hedge trees. It will nest in the dense, scrubby structure of the hedge. It will feed on snails and worms and invertebrates from the hedge base, especially if there's a good wet ditch at the base of the hedge, before moving on to hedge berries later in the year. In fact, the closer you look at our native ecology, the more species you'll find that thrive in this woodland edge habitat. But why? So this is where it gets a touch controversial, but an alternative theory to the closed canopy theory, which is the one that says a squirrel could merrily hop from tree to tree, Land's End to John O'Groats, was that one ancestral state of this island was a mosaic of woodland, glades, scattered trees, and areas kept open by large herbivores, all alongside plenty of scrub and all in flux at different stages of succession. And things weren't, of course, neatly sectioned off as they are today. So basically, we had much more of this woodland edge ecotone. And if this is what our ecology adapted to, it may help to explain why those cultural habitats that mimic this structure, so hedgerows, the gorgeous wood pasture and traditional orchards, are all so very rich in wildlife. Incidentally, it's actually this successionary scrub edge habitat created by herbivore movement that rewilded sites often transition to and prize. So rewilding and hedgerows may have more in common than you would initially have thought. So let's have a closer look at the structure of a good hedge. So from my point of view, a good hedge for wildlife tends to have a diverse shrub layer. So hedges with more plant species in them have a higher diversity of invertebrates and birds, partly because each plant that's in there will have different things that specialize on feeding on them, but also because it tends to mean a better year-round availability of food sources. All of these things flower and fruit at slightly different times of the year. Next up is a good size. So generally, increasing the width and the height of a hedgerow tends to increase both the diversity and the abundance of wildlife within it. So not only do wider and taller hedges provide more hedge volume, like physical volume, but they also increase the complexity of a habitat. So larger and more complex hedges provide better shelter for foraging birds and better and reduced predation for nesting birds as well. So although hedges should always be managed on a cycle, which will include cutting and rejuvenating, increasing the average size of a hedge within that cycle is a really good idea. Next up is structural complexity. So like with the thrush, some species need several hedge features throughout their life cycle. You can take this a step further too. Given that different species they have slightly different needs from a hedge, ideally we want to see many different hedge structures represented across a landscape at any one time. So some tall, some wider, all the different types of hedge structure, as long as they're all healthy. And happily, this is one of the benefits of managing hedgerows on rotation, which I will get to later in the talk. Next up, we've got good connectivity, which I've discussed with dormice. So actually, that reduces habitat fragmentation. And fragmentation is the limiting factor to the distribution of some of our species in the UK. And it's actually even thought to be a threat to the survival of some of the others. So hedges that don't have large gaps, hedges that connect other habitats like woodlands or ponds are particularly good for this sort of habitat connectivity. Then we've got a margin between the base of the hedge and any cultivation. This will not only protect the roots of the hedge shrubs and trees, it's also great for like wildflowers and grasses, which in turn are amazing for birds, small mammals and insects. So some hedges will also have a ditch, which I've already mentioned, but these ditches add even more potential wildlife habitat. They're fantastic. And the base of a hedge is also crucially important. So really, really vital for nesting birds, insects, reptiles, small mammals like the hedgehog, who likes to nest in this underbrush over summer. Unfortunately, the base of a hedge can often grow thin, either through grazing damage, if it's being slightly overgrazed, through over trimming, or even through overshading if the hedge has become slightly overgrown. And actually this sort of legginess, this loss of vegetation at the base is quite a good indicator that a hedge needs some rejuvenation work. And lastly, hedgerow trees, which I think deserve a slide to themselves. So trees are absurdly valuable in hedges. Over half of the priority species associated with hedges depend on hedge trees. They provide songposts and territory markers and loads of other important bird behaviours. They provide nesting opportunity for birds and bats and more. In a year where a hedge has been cut, hedge trees can still provide the flowers and fruits that a recently cut hedge itself can't. And of course, old trees, especially like those old pollard trees that you find in glorious ancient hedges, provide really valuable source of dead wood habitat for all of our like lovely and very endangered deadwood dependent species. We've got about over 2,000 deadwood dependent insect species in this country. At least 320 of these are known pollinators, so it's certainly worth taking care of them. But sadly, we lost a huge number of trees, hedge trees, to Dutch elm disease, and we're in the process of losing more to ash dieback. And we're not establishing enough new hedge trees to accommodate these losses. The bottom left of this slide shows a snip from an old Ordnance Survey map. And beside it, in the satellite image, is what the land looks like now. So obviously, we've lost a couple of hedges in there. But what I find striking is the loss of the mature hedgerow trees. Those are those dots that are individually indicated on that map. And they're almost all gone in the satellite imagery of what that looks like today. So in a time where tree planting is all the rage, establishing trees in hedgerows seems like an absolute no-brainer to me. It doesn't take any land out of crop production. It's replacing what has been lost over time already. They form open-grown trees, which the benefits of them could be a whole talk in itself. They can be managed for timber or wood fuel or additional crop production. They could be coppiced, they could be pollarded, they could be left as standards. They're really flexible. Small trees can be used in east-west hedges, and this can like reduce any crop shading impact. And large trees can be used in north-south hedges, and this has added benefits of protecting from the prevailing wind. They can even be established for free through natural regeneration. And this is a really good way of doing it, by the way, is just tag suitable young saplings in the hedgerow and spare them from the trim. So this has the added benefit of helping to preserve some of the genetic diversity present in your local tree populations. And genetic diversity is crucial defense of any population against the unknown threats of the future. So one way I like to imagine it is one oak may be naturally better in drought conditions, while another oak may be better able to tolerate floods, and a third oak may have some natural resistance to whatever new tree disease may be on the horizon. So certainly preserving all of this diversity needs to be a priority for our future tree populations. But of course, trees can also be planted, and call me an optimist, but whenever I see a gap in a hedge, I always think it's just the perfect opportunity to plant a new hedgerow tree. All the while, these hedgerow trees are providing benefits for wildlife. They're storing carbon, they're cleaning our air, they're reducing flood potential, they're adding to the beauty of the countryside. And of course, the origin story of a hedge, as well as the location, can have a big impact on all of these structural features that I've just mentioned, as well as the diversity within a hedge. Not all hedges were born equal. So the oldest hedges I know of are down in Cornwall, and some estimate these to be about 6,000 years old, which blows my mind. Cornish hedges are stone-faced banked hedges, which gives a wonderful new set of niches itself. And they may or may not have woody plants growing on top. And of course, in windy coastal areas like Cornwall, the species that thrive in a hedge may be totally different than from in other areas of the country. Then some hedges, which we call assart hedges, are the boundaries that were left as fields were literally cut from woodland. These hedges are often fantastically diverse and represent the ancient diversity of the woodlands and the ancient landscape from which they were cut. You'll often find ancient woodland indicator plants in assart hedges, which, to be honest, isn't really very surprising, since they are literally the remnants of an ancient woodland. So I don't think I have a photo of an assart hedge, unfortunately, but bottom right is an ancient woodland, and next to it is a hedge with many of the classic woodland floor species. Funnily enough, assart hedges often have at least one curved edge to one of their sides. And when you think about it, it's quite obvious. You get more area, you get more field area for less clearing if you cut with a curve. Next up are the banked hedges of the West Country, my favourites. So the picture in the bottom left of this slide is my home village. And that there is a clay bank, 2 meters high by 2 meters wide, with woody growth on top, trees and shrubs and everything, and wildflowers all up the bank sides. It's thought that over half of Devon's hedges are medieval or older, and they show an absolute glorious diversity. So the bank itself adds a really interesting element, as the soils within it are largely undisturbed, which when you think about it, it's quite rare. It's quite rare to get that much undisturbed soil structure. And this allows the roots to escape the perils of close cultivation, the perils of compaction, and these banked hedges are also generally paired with a ditch on one side. And I know I'm repeating myself, but I just have to say one more time, a ditch adds so much for a hedge diversity. It's a damp environment that's perfect for invertebrates, which help feed our birds, as well as a whole different array of like water, boggy loving herbaceous plants. So then we come to enclosure hedges. So an image of that is top right. So these were planted as part of the land enclosures, where common land was hedged in and taken for the aristocracy. This went on for about 500 years or so, but peak enclosure was between 1750 and 1820, when about 200,000 miles of hedging was planted. To begin with, the saplings were wild collected from nearby woodland and scrub, but as demand rose, so did the realization that there was profit to be made. So nurseries soon sprung up to supply the increasing demand for hedging material. And as such, enclosure hedges, especially late enclosure hedges, tend to be single species, mostly hawthorn, planted in, to my mind, fairly boring straight lines. but they're very common across the central part of the country. So mixed species hedges have, I would say, many advantages over these single species hedgerows, both to wildlife, as I've covered, but also interestingly in terms of how robust the hedge itself is. Now, you may have heard of Hooper's rule. It's the premise that you can age a hedge by the number of species in a 30-metre section of it. Well, there is a lot of truth to the idea that hedges gather species over time. But Hooper's rule should be taken with a little bit of caution, especially as most modern hedges are now planted with a glorious mix of several different woody species. But also knowing the various origin stories, like I've got pictured here, of hedges can really be important in effectively aging them, as well as looking back at old tithe maps and things. They can be really helpful too. So you may be surprised how old some of these hedges are. No hedge looks 1,000 years old, but that's really in the nature of the habitat, really. Sadly, obviously, some of our hedges are in better shape than others, and the management they have has a huge impact on both their capacity to sustain wildlife and even their capacity to act as effective wildlife corridors. This photo was actually taken in Kent, minus Gandalf, and was part of the testing phase of our hedge survey. The hedgerows in this area were so poor and fragmented that it was difficult to get a section of hedgerow long enough to survey. The level of fragmentation shown here obviously makes it near impossible for things like dormice to use these hedges for any of their three main uses. Sadly, also, we went through some dark decades of incentivized hedge removal after the war, and it's thought we lost up to about 50%. Many of these can be seen as shadows in the countryside. Actually, the hedges on the left here, I'm not quite sure, but these could be the remnants of assart hedges. As you can see, they've all got that sort of curved frontier line. It could be just that they're on a hill, but I like to think that those are assart hedges or were. Incidentally, there's a fascinating website that allows you to see old Ordnance Survey maps side by side with the satellite images of now. I've put the link on the screen, but it does come with a warning. This website is hugely addictive and you could waste hours on this. So I'm glad to say that the outright removal is largely behind us, especially in the agricultural sector, although we are still losing quite a lot of hedges to development. But now we see new hedges being planted more than ever, which is fantastic news. But I would say it is always worth remembering that what we have now shouldn't be considered a baseline, that new hedges don't adequately replace the value of old ones. And given the historic loss that we've seen, it's more important than ever that our remaining hedgerows are healthy. And sadly, we do still risk losing many of our hedgerows, largely through the way that we are managing them. The last countryside survey showed that only 48% of our hedges were in good structural condition, and only 31% of hedges were in good structural condition with appropriately managed margins. This drops down to just 10% in some areas of arable land. And in a lot of cases, this is a result of hedgerows no longer being managed according to their life cycle. And when we look at the trend in species that depend on hedgerows, it doesn't paint a pretty picture. So this is the trend for farmland bird indicator species between 1970 and 2019, and it's pretty dire. And remember that 84% of these species depend on hedges in some way or another. Similarly, 51% of our dormice since the year 2000, a roughly similar number of our rural hedgehog population, and sadly, other similar declines pretty much across the board. So now I must stress that this isn't all down to hedgerows. We know there are several other factors contributing to these declines, but given that these species all depend on healthy, well-managed hedgerows, making sure that we provide these could well be a well-needed lifeline for these species. Even if you don't give two hoots about wildlife, hedge decline isn't great, partly because of all of the additional benefits that we're missing out on. I'm often told that hedgerows have lost their function and wire fences are now cheaper and easier way to control livestock. But this ignores all of the other practical, on-farm and environmental benefits that hedges bring us. Stock-proof fencing is not their only value. So what have hedges ever done for us? There is another webinar later on in the week about the many benefits of hedges, which will give you a much better view on this, but I'll give you a quick intro to some of the many, many values that they bring. Let's start with livestock. So I've heard that hedges make a great stock-proof barrier, but in addition to this, they provide really valuable shelter. So livestock without shelter have higher mortality rates and require more food, so it's expensive. Shelter increases lamb survival rates in the spring, especially with all of these sort of unseasonable spring storms that we get, as it reduces the effect of wind chill and hypothermia on the young lambs. And actually the shelter that a hedge provides into a field can extend up to 16 times the height of a hedge, which is great. So if you increase the height of a hedge, you get more shelter. Brilliant. Next up, shade. So in the summer months, heat stress can take a huge toll on livestock. You'll often see cows and sheep crowding into the shady areas of a field, as heat stress can reduce milk yield in dairy herds. It can affect fertility, it affects growth rates, and it affects their immune function. Next up, diet diversity. So livestock will often be seen browsing on hedge plants and trees, even if they're just put into a field full of fresh pasture. This supplementary browsing on diverse plants is great for them in general. And if you've ever picked blackberries or sloes from a hedge, then you know that the benefits can extend to us too. But livestock have even been able to shown to be able to self-medicate to certain degrees by browsing on common species found in hedgerows, which I think is fantastic. Next up, biosecurity. So thick stock-proof hedges can be a barrier to the spread of diseases because it reduces animal-to-animal contact and some other animal behaviours. And lastly, for livestock, the wind shelter that hedges provide can actually extend the pasture growing season by allowing the pasture soils to warm earlier in the year, which is amazing. But if you aren't interested in livestock, and it is the arable areas that we do need to do to make sure understand the value of hedges, hedges can also benefit crops. So again, hedges act as a really good windbreak, and this reduces the damage that high and cold winds can do, such as crop lodging, which is basically when your crops just get blown over, premature flower and fruit shedding, shoot damage, chilling injuries, so on and so forth. They can also help us reduce our dependence on pesticides. They do this by increasing the populations of beneficial insects, such as predatory spiders, ground beetles, parasitic wasps and hoverflies, ladybirds, all sorts. And these really can go from the hedge into the field to help control the crop pest species, which helps prevent their populations getting out of control. Of course, they also help support a diverse population of pollinators. And they do this by ensuring there's enough pollinator forage, or flowers to you and me, to sustain them through the year when our crops aren't in flower. Which is really important because like a bunch of our crops are only in flower for a week or two. So, you know, our pollinators have got a week for the rest. But what hedges also provide areas of uncropped land. And this is often overlooked, but uncropped land is essential as part of these pollinator species life cycles and is a really crucial for pollinator overwintering in particular. Next up, hedges can reduce soil erosion by reducing surface wind speeds and by acting as a barrier to waterborne runoff. And while we're talking about water, I should probably mention they also play a really important role in times of flood. So plant roots increase the rate of water infiltration into the soil. So this helps the soil act like a sponge to soak up floodwater rather than allowing it to run off the surface. So tree and hedgerow roots are actually deeper than most crop roots, and this allows like a larger and deeper area of the soil profile to act like that sponge, so soaking up more water. And of course, water isn't the only thing hedges soak up. They also soak up pollution. So air pollution, noise pollution, and a bunch of the sediments in field runoff, which helps stop as much of that reaching our rivers. And of course, they also soak up carbon, which they store both in the woody stuff above ground and in the soil. So their contribution to our fight against climate change is rapidly being recognised. The IPCC recently said we should extend our hedges by about 40%. Natural England have gone a step further and recommended 60%. And the NFU have also highlighted how valuable hedges are in hitting their target of net zero by 2040. So how do we increase the carbon in hedges? Well, luckily there are lots of ways. With just a few tweaks in management, like establishing more hedgerow trees, filling in hedgerow gaps, allowing hedges to be bigger on average, they could be doing an awful lot more of this for us. And that's before we even get into the idea of planting more hedges, which is also fantastic. So we've got about between 400 and 500,000 kilometres of managed hedgerows. Many of them are in need of more trees anyway, and a little bit more growth anyway. So hedges really could be making a real contribution in this area. So back to the list of hedgerow benefits. Hedges can provide a sustainable source of wood, again, without losing land from production. So this can have commercial or private use as fuel or timber. Pollarding is a traditional management of trees in hedgerows and can provide both smaller diameter wood, but also animal fodder in the form of tree hay, which is a fantastic idea. The way I see it, if healthy hedges can pay their way, we're much more likely to see them looked after and thriving in the future. Wood isn't the only additional crop you can grow in a hedge. You can also, they've always have and still will be used to grow fruit crops for additional income, which can sort of supplement the rest of the farm. Then lastly, we've got privacy. So hedges can act as a screen and protect privacy, helping us comfortably sunbathe in our own gardens on days like today. But in the countryside, they can also help shield farm assets from sight. And this has an impact in reducing opportunistic rural crime. Then, of course, there are all the less quantifiable but extremely important benefits, such as a sense of place, and of course, our general health and well-being. Hedges are a defining feature in our countryside, with deep and significant cultural and historical importance. They tell the story of our farming traditions over many centuries. So how do we manage for healthy hedgerows? I will take you on a very quick tour of basic principles of good hedge management. So the first one sometimes comes a bit of a surprise, but hedgerows do actually require management in order to stop them developing into a line of trees. So a line of trees doesn't sound like a bad thing. We all love trees, but everything competes for light, especially because they're so closely planted. They actually just all grow straight upwards. They race for the light up. They lose all of that thick, dense structure at the base, which is so valuable for wildlife. And of course, then they get top heavy. Many of them will topple, and over time, it will get more and more gappy and eventually lost. Okay, so we've gathered that hedges do need to be cut, but the devil is in the detail. So how and how often they're cut makes all of the difference. When they're young or recently rejuvenated, cutting a hedge fairly frequently can be a good thing. It changes the balance of hormones, helping create that dense structure. So most of our hedge plants respond to the growing tips being cut off by putting more effort into branching growth. And if you keep doing this by cutting a bit higher and a bit wider each time, you end up creating this amazing density of growth that provides such great shelter for nesting birds and mammals. But what about when you've established this structure? How often should you cut then? Well, most of our hedge plants blossom and fruit on second-year wood. And this means that if you cut your hedge every year, you cut most of this potential off. The hedge on the left on the screen here hasn't been cut in a few years. It's absolutely covered in berries. Earlier in the year, it would have been equally covered in blossom. The image on the right, taken just 5 minutes afterwards, is another hawthorn hedge, but one that gets trimmed every year. And as you can see, it is completely devoid. And this works with the blossom as well. So These photos show exactly the same thing with blossom. The top left was cut in January this year. One was cut in January last year, and that gorgeous blooming wonder at the bottom was cut January the year before. Again, it shows just how much floral diversity, how much blossom you can get with a relaxed cutting regime. And another beauty of a relaxed cutting regime is that you actually only have to trim about 1/3 of your hedges each year, which is a bonus. So cutting your hedges, but in longer rotations, seems like a win. But unfortunately, cutting often goes hand in hand with cutting at the same height. And together, these two things lead to another issue threatening our hedges, and that's chronic over-trimming. So over-trimming not only reduces the value of a hedge to wildlife, but also threatens the structure of the hedge itself. It creates a knuckle of scar tissue at the trim line. It loses density at the base of the hedge, and then stems start to be lost. And while at first the remaining hedge plants can kind of stretch to fill the space, which always reminds me of this painting, the more plants that are lost, the more difficult it is for them to do this. And eventually you'll see gaps forming in the hedge, and these gaps will extend if the hedgerow management doesn't see a change. Oh, hello. So this is a real problem for hedges, but you sort of have to use your imagination and speed up time to really picture it. And that's what I have attempted to do here.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end of our elaborate plan.
Which is quite the depressing watch, sorry. But luckily, this is completely avoidable. Back when hedges were trimmed by hand, the slashes would inevitably not take off all of the year's growth, as the oldest bits were already woody and tough. And it meant that hedges tended to get slightly bigger at every cut. And it's actually pretty easy to mimic this with mechanical tools. Just cut slightly higher and slightly wider each year. It might just be 10 centimeters, but it will make a difference. It means you avoid the structural damage at the trim line. It means you keep a border of young wood around the edge, which means you always have flowers and fruit, even on cutting years. And you end up with this lovely, thick, dense hedge at the end of it. And if you're worried that it might get unmanageably big, well, at 10 centimeters higher each time, cutting every 3 years, it will take 30 years before it just gets a meter taller. So it isn't desperate. Even if you're cutting every year, it'll still take a decade before your hedge has got a meter taller. So I think we can accommodate that. And after this, if the space allows, it can be put into something called a non-intervention period, which basically just means you let it grow out for a decade or so, to go all woolly and big and frothy. And after that, that's at the point where you can reshape the hedge, or ideally rejuvenate it. So I think I've covered how often and how. Next up, when. So many hedges are cut in September, when everything seems to get tidied up in the countryside. But this sadly cuts off all the nuts and the berries. So hedges are supposedly wildlife's larder, helping birds and mammals fatten up in preparation for winter. But cutting them in September means they don't get this chance, no matter how good your hedge is. Instead, it's best to cut late winter wherever possible, so wherever the soil conditions allow. And lastly, no matter how well you manage your hedge, it will at some point need rejuvenation. So this could be hedge laying or coppicing, and essentially it resets the hedge cycle. It thickens the hedge back up from the base, and from here you can start the whole process again. The photo here shows a recently and beautifully laid hedge. So hedge laying is where the stem of a hedge is cut almost all the way through at the base, and then it's bent over and bound in place. That's a very crude description of a very skilled job, so I hope there aren't too many hedge layers listening. But essentially, the low cut encourages new and plentiful shoots to come from the base. And this is why it thickens it up from the base. But of course, the existing stem that remains connected stays alive. So binding this in place forms an instant living stock-proof fence, which I think is pretty genius. So this process resets that cycle of succession and allows a fresh start. And if this rejuvenation part of a hedge management stops indefinitely, a hedge will inevitably decline and be lost. So it's amazing when you think about it. Every ancient hedge that we have, those dating back hundreds and hundreds of years, all of them exist today because maybe once in a generation, each hedge has been laid or maybe coppiced. So I believe later this week, I think Friday, there's a talk from the amazing Nigel Adams, who will no doubt give a fantastic description of this. So I won't say too much more, except at how incredible I think it is that the reason we still have so many ancient hedges is thanks to an unbroken chain of management and periodic rejuvenation, each hedge carefully laid from time to time through their many centuries. Hedges are essentially made immortal by the skills of management passed from farmer to farmer, hedge layer to hedge layer, generation to generation. And hedges will only survive if we offer them similar care and consideration. So this is what all of that management looks like in a cycle. And this is my favourite diagram of all time, again, based on the work of Nigel Adams and HedgeLink. What it shows is that hedgerows are dynamic. They're a dynamic living habitat, so need dynamic management based on their life cycle. They aren't just green walls, and they can't be treated as such. It isn't possible to keep a hedge at the same point in this cycle for too long without seeing structural decline. Some may decline faster than others, some so slowly you'd barely notice the change, but they will decline. So this diagram does look a bit complicated at first sight, but what I love about it is that no matter where your hedge is on the life cycle, it shows that there is a way of bringing it back into being in a healthy condition. In the centre here, that central circle, here are the dense and well-managed hedges. The management here includes rotational cutting, incremental size increase, periods of non-intervention, but crucially, it will always at some point go up to this point at the top, which is rejuvenation. So laying or coppicing or maybe reshaping to really thicken the hedge back up and reset that clock. And depending on how often how well you manage your hedge, you may only need to do this every 40 or so years. The problems in hedge management, the ones I've described earlier, are represented in the two side flanks. So here on the left, you see hedges that have become overstood. So as I mentioned before, hedges do require some management or they will be lost to gappy lines of trees. And on the right-hand side, this is the process of over trimming, trying to keep a hedge in the same sort of box shape for too long. Again, it loses structure at the base, it develops a hard knuckle at the trim line, it loses stems, becomes gappy. These ones, I would say, are a priority to fix, as not only are they disappearing slowly in front of us, but they're not even really fulfilling any of the benefits in the meantime, not to wildlife, not to climate, or to land managers. So if this seems like a lot to take in all at once, you're in luck. We've created some tools to help on a hedge by hedge basis. So back to our dormouse reintroductions. The idea is we wanted to create a survey that health checked these hedges, giving instant feedback. As we did this, we were able to build bespoke management advice based on the hedgerow survey cycle for each hedgerow surveyed. We didn't need to reinvent the wheel to do this. Instead, we built on and pieced together some of the fantastic work done over the years by HedgeLink and its members. And with this survey, which we call the Great British Hedgerow Survey, we hope to directly guide appropriate hedgerow management, whilst also getting like a landscape scale understanding of hedgerow health, which can help us understand where future conservation effort is needed. And very soon, excitingly, we will have a brand new survey app. called Healthy Hedgerows. And this is a rapid assessment survey of hedges in just 6 questions. It's specifically aimed at farmers and landowners wanting to assess all of the hedges on their land to update their management plans. This one's being developed as part of Close the Gap, which is one of the Green Recovery Challenge Fund projects. So what do we ultimately want to see? I want to see hedgerows bigger, better and more joined up. I want to see them fulfilling their potential economically, ecologically and environmentally. I want to see them managed on a life cycle again, with fewer gaps and more trees. Whole books can and have been written about the wildlife that lives, feeds and travels in our hedgerows, and they'd still barely scratched the surface. So any picture I've attempted to paint today will certainly not do justice to the importance of this network, especially at this time when we're seeing such worrying declines in our wildlife. So I hope I've convinced you that hedges are incredible, fascinating and valuable beyond measure. But what now? How can we all help? Well, if you own a hedge, I would say take a closer look at it. Look at its structure, look at its health, and make sure you're managing it dynamically according to the relevant stage of its life cycle. Again, the new app, Healthy Hedgerows, which will be out soon, will help you do this on a farm scale. The next thing you can do is show off your amazing hedges and make all of your neighbours jealous with the best big, bountiful, beautiful hedges you can grow. If you don't own a hedge, like many of us, there are still ways that you can help directly. So, of course, you can do the Great British Hedgerow Survey. Simple to do, provides a complete health check, but crucially, it creates a downloadable PDF of these results with recommended management based on each hedge surveyed. So far, we've already got fantastic groups of people up and down the countryside working alongside farmers and landowners, providing these health checks and then sharing the resultant management advice, doing absolutely amazing work. Another thing you can do, as I also mentioned earlier, is tag young hedge tree saplings and spare them from the trim. I was chatting to someone the other day who is already doing this. He said he'd noticed that all of the trees in the hedges near him were old, and he was worried that the trimming regimes weren't allowing for new hedgerow trees to come through. He was right. So he chatted to his local farmer down the pub, who completely agreed. This chap is now marking potential young hedgerow saplings with big colourful sticks, and the farmer has instructed the trimming contractor to avoid them when it comes to hedge trimming. This is a simple, elegant solution that benefits everyone. I also spoke to another amazing individual recently who wrote to her local council asking whether they could update their hedge cutting regime in light of the climate and wildlife crisis. And marvellously, they are now working together to put in a more dynamic plan in place for their local council managed hedgerows. Alternatively, if you have space, I would say think about setting up a community nursery. So by planting saplings from locally collected tree seed, you're making some of that gorgeous and very essential genetic diversity is maintained. Our hedges are our Noah's Arks of genetic diversity. Then what we can do with these wonderful saplings is we can work with farmers or community and make sure these are the plants that fill hedge gaps or establish new hedgerow trees. And lastly, I would say go out and look at your hedges. Go see what you can see in them. Have a look at the plants, the insects, the birds, the trees, its structure. I guarantee when you get a greater appreciation for the humble hedge, you will find yourself coming up with your own new and imaginative ways of helping. I think the future looks good for hedgerows. They've been with us in some form since the Bronze Age and have weathered some pretty turbulent times. Last century wasn't the first time, nor will it be the last in all likelihood, that politics has had a big impact on our hedges. From land enclosures to riots and uprisings, the history of hedges is almost as fascinating as their wildlife. But now we're recognising the plethora of benefits that they bring us on so many levels. There is a growing interest in making sure they survive and thrive. So the privilege of caring for them, and the responsibility of ensuring they have a healthy future now falls to us, as we are the next ones that write the next chapter in their history books. So, for goodness sake, let it be a good one. Thank you.
I want to say a huge thank you, Megan, for absolutely, on behalf of everybody, a riveting presentation, inspired us all, encyclopedic in the knowledge that it shared, really incredible. We've had dormice and predatory spiders and bats, as well as all the hedges. I know that there are quite a few questions. If you need 2 seconds just to pause after your presentation.
Oh, I'm okay. I can talk about hedges all day.
Okay.
I've just gone far over time, so I've proven that.
There are quite a few about hedge composition. We have people who say, I have hedges dominated by ivy. If I stripped it, would it leave the hedge bare? Do you have any ideas about the best thing to do in cases like this? And then there's another question again about, should we remove nettles and brambles from the bottom of a hedge to improve light and to help rejuvenate? So it's
two very good questions. Yeah. So the ivy one is a really interesting one. It depends on the hedge really, but ivy is often a sign of a struggling hedge. So often if you cut a hedge to the same level each year, you'll get like this wall of ivy that kind of sticks at that level. And you'll notice it because it's green even in winter. You'll always see it there. But what this does is it means the ivy, which is fairly like tolerant of shading, can create this like impenetrable barrier. And every year your hedge plants actually get trimmed back to that same level. And what that does is it cuts the light out from the internal bits of the hedge, and it can sort of increase how much it hollows out. So ivy at the face of a hedge line is one of those sort of telltale signals that your hedge might need like a slight change in management to increase it in size or whatever. If you've got ivy going up the trunks and the stems, again, they can actually swamp ivy. Don't get me wrong, I love ivy as a plant. It's fantastic for biodiversity, but in its place. And here it's actually a really useful indicator that your hedge needs a change of management. So when it's on the trunks of hedge stems, it's often another sort of telltale sign that your hedge needs rejuvenation. And it tends to be that when you lay a hedge, when you coppice a hedge, you actually strip that ivy out, because then you lay the hedge, and otherwise the ivy will swamp the regrowth. So I would say yes, take some of the ivy out and have a look at the structure underneath. And then you can probably have a look at the structures that I put up earlier and see whether you think that hedge needs rejuvenation as well. My hunch is that if it's swamped with ivy, it probably does need some work. Lots of brambles and nettles as well. Sorry, I forgot about those ones. So nettles, cleavers and docks at the base of a hedge are what we use in our survey as a proxy for like too much nutrients going in. So, too much fertilizer, or, just too much nutrients at the base of a hedge. And it's not that nettles are bad. It's not that docks or cleavers are bad. It's just that a lot of our native wildflowers can't actually survive in soils that have been overly too many nutrients put in. They actually can't tolerate it. It kills off the fungal associations that they need to survive. Not only that, but things like docks and cleavers and nettles, they're quite sort of bullies of plants, really. They just sort of boof up, and actually they can shade out a lot of our wildflowers. So it's a bit of a double threat for wildflowers, really. So while there's nothing wrong with those species per se, we do use those species as a bit of a proxy for how much extra nutrients are being put on that soil.
Great, thank you. That's fantastic. I learned something there. There's quite a few questions on policy, which I'm just going to sort of gather together. Number one, have you been involved at all in any of the elms test and trials? And you touched a little bit in your history slide about, what does the future hold for hedgerow management? And will the new elms, is it likely to help?
I hope so, yes. We have been not directly in the tests and trials, but we have, through HedgeLink, we've been involved in consultation and through PTES as well, through the consultation stages of these setups. And so far, I'm fairly optimistic about what we've seen. We haven't seen everything that we need to see yet from the new scheme coming through, but what we have seen is that they are including things like incremental size increase for hedgerows, which is a really good start. And the idea that not all of your hedges can be cut every year, which again is another good one. From my point of view, what I would love to see is a greater emphasis on hedge rejuvenation, because it doesn't matter how well you manage your hedge, you know, between rejuvenation. If you don't rejuvenate a hedge, it will die in the long term. It will thin, it will lose stems, it will go. Hedge rejuvenation, like hedge laying and coppicing, has always been in what gets paid for by the government schemes, but sometimes it may have been slightly inaccessible to everybody. So what I'm hoping for in the next set of schemes is that hedge rejuvenation is a bigger focus and it's easier to get that money.
Great, thanks, Megan. There's an interesting question here about city hedgerows, which, as you know, is just as much a part of the Close the Gap and Talk to the Hedges programme. Are we aware of any campaigns or programmes for communities to plant in gardens? And this person is in Birmingham, in quite a built-up area. We have hedgehogs and dragonflies, and it would be great to do more. So if I may, I might just leap in and say that we have, as part of this Green Recovery Challenge Fund project, we do have some community grant funding. So if you'd like to apply for a grant to plant city hedgerows or hedgerows in the countryside with your local community, do please be in touch. Go to the National hedgerowweek.org.uk website, and you'll find details there on how to apply for that. I don't know if you want to say anything about city hedgerows, Megan.
Oh, well, there's so much to say. I would say there tends to be lots of really good local groups. So I would say speak to your local wildlife trust, speak to your local community group. There'll often be things going on. I've seen a number of pop-up community nurseries that are fantastic. As I said, like, retaining the genetic diversity of our tree population is absolutely central to protecting our trees in the future. If all of the trees that we plant for future generations are of like a similar genetic source, then we've essentially imposed a genetic bottleneck on our trees unnecessarily, and that will make them weaker in the future. So I would say speak to local projects in your area. Think about maybe setting some up yourself if there aren't any there.
Great, thanks. And then, I mean, we've talked quite a lot, you talked quite a lot about, you know, flailing and management and so on and so forth. There have been a few questions about how do we convince contractors and landowners to do the right thing? And then somebody else has said, how do we get over the idea that neat and tidy hedgerows are desirable?
Oh, if I knew the answer to that. I think explaining the value of hedges to landowners is probably my favorite way of doing this. I mean, as I said, with the whole what have hedgerows ever done for us, they provide huge benefits, even if you don't care about wildlife, huge benefits on farm. So I hope if we sort of champion all of those benefits, that maybe that they start taking root. In terms of the messiness, this is completely true. I've spoken to a lot of farmers that say they actually get complaints if they don't cut their hedges every year because it makes the village look untidy. So it's as much for us to change our opinions really as landowners to change theirs. You know, from a farmer's point of view, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't in terms of when they get complaints. So I think for every complaint that we guess might be sent into a council or sent to a farmer, we should compliment when hedges are left, because I think we should at least be matching those complaints with our compliments and our positivity, because if they're not heard, then you know then the voice for the messy isn't heard. I also think, as someone that for my entire life I've been told I look like I've come through a hedge backwards, I think we just need to start embracing this kind of messy chic, and as you know, as soon as we start embracing that slightly sort of wild attitude in all of our areas of life, we may start allowing that in hedgerows too. So
You
that's
found
maybe
a new phrase there, definitely. Time is moving on. We have one, the last question to finish on a modern question. Ian Brown has asked, what would a modern hedge look like? You know, could we create a multifunctional habitat that is beyond linear? What would that look like, and would it work?
That looks like an entire hour's further talk. Yes, absolutely. So the hedges of the past don't have to be the hedges of the future. If we're putting hedges in, we have the opportunity to design those hedgerows. If we don't care about stock-proof fencing, if we're doing them for wood fuel, we'll use some sort of fast-growing species. If we don't want to manage the hedges too much, we'll use some slower-growing species. You know, putting all of as many species as you can possibly fit in for a wildlife hedge. I'd say if it's near a village or a town or a city even, then fruiting hedges I think are an absolute benefit. So really it depends where in the country it is and what the purpose of the hedge is. Whenever we plant a hedge, we're in the privileged position that we can design it from scratch. We know what works well for different situations. We can make it work for us. So I'd say, you know, go ahead and design your own hedge, but be clear what your objectives are for that hedge, and then it will bounds to be an absolute success.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Megan. I think you definitely have coined a new phase with the messy chic. I love that. You've been amazing. And I know that we will be sharing the recording links and so on afterwards. I want to thank you. And I want to thank our awesome audience. There have been many of you who've been listening this evening. And sadly, we have to come to the end now. But do share the recording link with others if you wish. It will be available. There'll be an email going out with the links later in the week. And of course, as Megan said, there are lots of other hedge talks in this series, webinars with fabulous guest speakers. We've got writers, artists, musicians, horticulturalists, all relating to hedgerows. Storytelling is coming up tomorrow, The Happy Hedgerow, with an author, an illustrator, a bookseller, a publisher, and so on and so forth. And then to close, we've got hedgerow plants and what they can teach humanity with John Drury next Sunday, and lots of things in between. So let's all talk to the hedge. That's the slogan for the campaign. Please share your hedgerow pictures and stories on social media. Use that hashtag, and we've got lots of very delicious hedgy prizes for those who share the best pictures. So finally, thank you again to all those who have joined and who have supported already with a donation. If you, having heard this fantastic conversation from Megan, if you would like to pledge a metre of hedgerow to help us double our commitment, which we already have, to 50 kilometres of hedgerow, you can go to the nationalhedgerowweek.org.uk website and you can do it there. So thank you again, Megan. Thank you to all our partners, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much, and bye-bye from all of us.